Let's have a quick look of how this RPA that executes this flow looks like. To do that, let's go to our service manager. This is our service manager, and we will go to the automation RPA section. Here is where we define our RPA processes. And let's edit the RPA that was executed by this flow. This is how an RPA looks like in our system, and specifically this RPA that invokes the loading of the invoices. On the left side you can see a visual editor that describes the flow of the RPA, and on the right side you would see a properties pane that is changed according to the node that I am focusing on. So this is how it looks like, and let's have a quick look of the different parts here on the RPA. So on the first node of the RPA, the root of the RPA, we would see all the inputs that this RPA gets, and we could see the outputs that will be returned back from the RPA. And down there we will see all the nodes that will be executed inside this RPA. For example, this node is a service, which is an API that interacts with the Oracle EBS system. This specific node, for example, will create the invoice header. As any service node, it has a few input parameters, and you can see here that it has some credentials and the name of the customer that will be added to the invoice header. So this is an example of how we call a service inside a full flow. Later on, we have a loop here that goes over the CSV file that we have added as an attachment to the mail. And inside this loop that reads the file, we have a condition, and we have here a call to services, more services that interact with the EBS system. Each one of these services also has its own inputs, but since it is inside this loop, the inputs are getting its values from the loop values, the iteration values that iterates over the file. So if we will go, for example, here, you can see that when we set an input for this API call, we can say we want to take it from the loop, from the invoice line. Here we see the fields inside this file. We have an item column, quantity column, unit price, and we can select any one of them and attach it to the right input. So in our case, the item will come from the item column, the quantity will come from the quantity column, etc. And at the end, we are sending a mail to the one who invoked this flow to say that everything is okay. And here on the mail parameters, we can put strings, and also we can add here output values from the flow. For example, we can add to the header the number of the newly created transaction. This is very briefly how we can create a flow in our Player Service Manager. Of course, we can then test it here from the editor itself, but there are a few other ways to execute a flow. Let's have a quick look on that as well. So one way is to run the RPA as an attended RPA. This is just going here, pressing on this play button, which actually translates into a URL of our server. This will upload a web page with all the parameters that are needed to invoke this RPA, and you will be able to put here whatever values you want to and execute the RPA. This is one way to invoke an RPA with Oracle. Another way is to trigger the RPA. Like in our example, we triggered it through emails. So we have here a special tab called triggers, and there are two triggers that we can use to invoke an RPA. One is the scheduled, and the other one is the email. The scheduled trigger let's see an example of it, just enables you to invoke an RPA through a scheduler. You can set a specific instance, a specific date and time to run the RPA, or you can say that you want it to run repeatedly and say on which days and what would be the interval. Would it be every X hours, days, whatever you want. So this is the scheduler option. And sorry. And the other option is to trigger it through mail, like we demoed in this video. And this is how a mail trigger looks like. It has, of course, the RPA that it needs to run, and then it has the template of the mail that you need to set in order for the system to recognize it. So you can filter the mails by the senders and say that only mails that come from specific senders will be recognized by the system. You can set the subject, the template of the subject. In our case, we had the specific words create invoice for, and then you can also integrate parameters like the customer name. These parameters, we would be able to use them later as parameters to the RPA flow. So here, on the bottom part, where we have the inputs from the RPA flow that we invoke with this trigger, we can say that the customer that we want to invoke in the RPA will take its value from the parameter that was integrated into the subject line. We can also say that this email has an attachment, so we can attach to it the CSV file as we did in our example. So this is very briefly how an email trigger looks like. And once you have set this trigger, you can send an email with these specific parameters on the subject, the specific template that you have defined in the email trigger, and once you will send it, our system will execute the RPA and process the information that was sent through the mail.